For 25 years, in my judgment, the police department was very contained, very poor leadership. We don't need help. Stay out of our way. Stay out of our business, which is tragic. They had no experience. The fellow investigating our case for 25 years was an auto theft investigator before he took this case over, and frankly, it was a roadblock. So that was very frustrating. They wouldn't accept help from the outside. I never criticized them for not having experience. I criticized them for refusing help from people that did and it was offered. We're hopeful now with the new police chief that was brought in from the outside, which was huge, that he will exercise good leadership and accept help from people that have offered it. To my knowledge, they have not worked with federal agencies. They have not worked with anybody outside of their group, and there's been so much offered. But the way our system works in this country, the police department, the police chief is in charge of his case, and if he doesn't want anybody to come in and look at it, they can't come in. I'm doing this for the sake of my children and my grandchildren. This cloud over our family's name needs to be lifted. They need to be able to go on and close this chapter and go on with their lives. It's hard on them, and you know, we've been maligned, and our family reputation's been tarnished, and I'm going to do my best to clear that up for the sake of my children. And we, you know, today finding the killer is not going to change my life. I've lost JonBenet. It's not going to bring JonBenet back. I would like to close this chapter so we can be more at rest and at peace. I won't give up pressing the authorities to do their job until I see that they do their job. And that's been the frustration for 25 years. Now with new leadership, we're hoping that the department will capitalize on the resources that have been offered to them.
What stood out wasn't only the business success or the grand house, it was the odd fractures that surfaced when pressure mounted. Colleagues described John as disciplined, even calculating. But when scrutiny arrived, his reactions veered from composed to strangely defensive. Investigators noticed his instinct was to close ranks, limit information, protect image first, transparency second. That behavior wasn't proof of guilt, but it was enough to raise suspicion. Financially, the picture wasn't as spotless as the glossy exterior suggested. While access graphics soared, corporate transitions meant constant evaluation. Contracts shifted, competition pushed harder, and carried the weight of keeping momentum alive. At the same time, whispers about neighborhood crime created another layer of insecurity. More than 100 break-ins reported nearby, too many to dismiss as coincidence. It painted a backdrop of unease, as if the Ramsey household, despite its walls and alarms, sat inside a storm of volatility. Psychologically, that tension left marks. John had lived for decades in environments where status and control mattered more than vulnerability. It trained him to suppress weakness, to manage perception. But when tragedy hit, that same training backfired. Instead of raw grief, many saw distance. Instead of chaos, they saw careful calculation. To some, it felt unnatural, a performance polished by years of corporate survival. And that is where the cracks deepen. Was John Ramsey a man under siege by forces outside his control, corporate rivalries, crime in his community, media frenzy, or was the polished executive image a shield for something darker? The unsettling truth is that before the case ever made headlines, the seeds of suspicion had already been planted in how he lived, how he worked, and how he reacted when the mask slipped. Before the case exploded into headlines, John Ramsey carried the reputation of a reserved man, someone who preferred the background to the spotlight. Friends described him as introverted, sometimes distant, a personality shaped more by numbers and boardrooms than by social gatherings. To outsiders, that quietness felt harmless. To critics, it later became suspicious, an opening for speculation that his silence concealed something far more troubling. After the tragedy, a swirl of online theories began to recast his private life in darker tones. Unproven allegations suggested he might have been involved in inappropriate behavior within his own household. These claims never materialized into evidence, never reached a courtroom, yet they gained traction in forums and late-night discussions. The fuel for such claims came not from hard proof but from fragments of subtle behaviors, strange details in police reports, and above all, the child's medical history. JonBenet's episodes of bedwetting became a focal point for theorists. In ordinary families, it might be dismissed as developmental, a common stress response in children. But in the crucible of a murder investigation, it became so much a potential red flag, reinterpreted through the harsh lens of suspicion. Was it simply childhood behavior, or a sign of deeper trauma? The answer never crystallized, and the absence of clarity only amplified conspiracy. Psychologically, this tension shows the way silence and ambiguity can breed doubt. John's lack of public vulnerability and his tendency to appear controlled fed a narrative that he was not grieving but hiding. Critics seized on every flat expression, every careful word. What might have been nothing more than shock became the foundation of entire theories about sensitive behavior to JonBenét in secrecy. No court confirmed these allegations. Still, the shadow lingers. In true crime circles, the absence of evidence doesn't always kill suspicion. It often keeps it alive, whispering beneath the surface. John Ramsey's first marriage to Lucinda Pash produced 3 children, anchoring in what appeared to be an ordinary American household. From the outside, it carried the hallmarks of stability: vacations, schools, the slow climb of a career. One of those children, John Andrew, later recalled the atmosphere as normal, a word meant to counter the darkness that followed. Yet beneath the surface, normal wasn't as simple as it sounded. Families rarely reveal the full weight of their private tensions until years later, when hindsight reshapes memories. Reports surfaced that health issues shadowed parts of the household, though specifics stayed vague. Whether minor ailments or more complex struggles, they added stress into a family already dealing with a father consumed by work. Corporate schedules, frequent travel, and ambition left gaps in presence. In that space, unspoken resentments and subtle conflicts had room to grow. Behavioral strains also entered the conversation. Accounts suggested there were patterns of small frictions between siblings, disagreements about discipline, and questions over parental style. Nothing explosive enough to trigger scandal. No public collapse of reputation. But enough to hint at pressure points lying dormant. In retrospect, these details took on heavier meaning, as if seeds of instability were planted long before December 1996. This is the paradox of family present: ordinary, even enviable, yet carrying unresolved cracks. When tragedy later struck, critics turned backward, searching these early years for signs. Every health concern, every behavioral note became a possible clue. Were these just natural hardships of a blended family, or the first shadows of a story that would one day become infamous? At the time, there was no scandal, no headlines. But the silence of those early tensions left room for speculation, and speculation, once ignited, rarely burns out. Allegations of sensitive behavior to JonBenét emerged not from direct testimony but from interpretations layered onto medical reports and behavioral notes. Experts reviewing the autopsy pointed to possible signs of prior trauma, fueling speculation that JonBenét may have endured inappropriate contact before her death. These conclusions were not unanimous. Other pathologists argued the findings could be explained by postmortem changes or unrelated medical conditions. Still, the suggestion was enough to stain John Ramsey's name in the court of public opinion. For years, he firmly denied every accusation. His defense rested heavily on science, and in 2008 DNA testing appeared to clear him. Samples taken from the child's clothing excluded immediate family members, pointing instead to an unidentified male profile. This exoneration became his shield, the technical proof that he was not the abuser some had painted him to be. Yet, as often happens in high-profile cases, absence of evidence did not silence suspicion. Online communities seized on the ambiguity. Platforms social built on endless debate, recycled theories suggesting John himself could have been responsible. They dissected his television interviews, his flat effect, his careful wording. Every pause became evidence, every smile framed as sinister. For believers, DNA only ruled out direct involvement in that single moment. It did not erase the possibility of a hidden history. What's striking is the psychological gap between perception and proof. Science cleared him, but culture kept him guilty in whispers. This is where conspiracy thrives, in the vacuum left by contradictions, in the refusal to accept that something so horrific could remain unsolved without family involvement. In truth, no verified record ties John Ramsey to prior sensitive behavior to JonBenét. Yet suspicion clings to him, not because of what was proven, but because of what could never be disproven. The setting surrounding the Ramsey household was far from the idyllic picture their wealth projected. Boulder, often portrayed as a haven for affluence and academic culture, carried its own shadows. Reports documented more than 100 break-ins and offenses in the neighborhood over a relatively short period. These incidents did not directly implicate John Ramsey, but they painted the backdrop of insecurity against which his family lived. In hindsight, this context allowed conspiracy theories to thrive. Critics argued that such a climate made intruder theories plausible, while others insisted the family itself remained the more likely source of danger. Financially, John was navigating a corporate world in transition. Access Graphics, the company he had steered to considerable success, was eventually sold to Lockheed Martin. While the deal reflected growth, it also introduced instability. Large-scale corporate acquisitions often bring winners and losers. Executives may secure payouts, but restructuring and shifts in valuation can erase personal stakes. For John, Whispers of potential financial loss circulated, though nothing hinted to corruption or fraudulent dealings. Still, the timing of the company's transition coinciding with turmoil in his private life gave critics material to question whether stress, money, and pressure played hidden roles. The psychological weight of these dual pressures living in a community marked by crime and managing corporate upheaval should not be underestimated. Executives accustomed to control often struggle when external factors erode that stability. For John, the appearance of calm may have been less about guilt and more about survival instinct, a businessman's training to remain steady when circumstances spun beyond his reach. No evidence proves his finances drove desperation, nor that neighborhood crime touched his household directly. Yet both elements add texture to his story, revealing that even before the tragedy, the Ramseys lived in an environment more fragile than their perfect facade suggested. Before the night that changed everything, John Ramsey and Fleet White were considered close friends. They moved in the same social circles, affluent families with ties in Boulder's upper class. White was even present at the Ramsey home in the hours after the tragedy, one of the very few outsiders to witness the scene firsthand. That level of access implied trust, the kind that usually comes only after as of personal connection. Yet, as time passed, the relationship fractured in ways that hinted at deeper tensions. By 2000, when John testified under oath, he referred to Fleet's behavior as strange. He didn't specify every detail, but the phrasing alone suggested suspicion. Friendships don't collapse overnight, they erode under pressure, often revealing fault lines that had been there long before. The public only saw the fallout, but the roots likely stretched further back. Some analysts have speculated that hidden disagreements may have simmered over values, over how each man handled the intense spotlight, or even over personal trust within their families. White's later vocal criticism of the investigation and his distance from the Ramseys amplified those suspicions. The shift from ally to adversary marked a turning point. It wasn't just the police who doubted John, but now one of his closest friends seemed to as well. Psychologically, this rift mattered. In high-stakes cases, social validation is everything. When a friend speaks of you in cautious or critical terms, the perception of innocence becomes harder to defend. John's description of Fleet as odd may have been defensive, an attempt to redirect suspicion outward, or it may have been genuine, reflecting fractures he had long noticed but never voiced. Either way, the broken friendship became another shadow in the Ramsey story, a reminder that behind the glossy surface, trust was fragile, and alliances could turn into liabilities overnight. Before he was known as a businessman or the father at the center of one of America's most haunting cases, John Ramsey wore a uniform. He served in the U.S. Navy, a period of his life marked by discipline, structure, and a reputation free of controversy. By all official accounts, his military service was unblemished. No formal complaints. No scandals. For many, that history should have stood as a pillar of credibility. Yet in the years after John Benet's death, even this seemingly solid part of his biography became fuel for speculation. Conspiracy theorists seized on the Navy connection, suggesting that his ties to military culture equipped him with the skills to cover tracks, manage crises, and control narratives. The logic was thin. Service in the armed forces does not automatically imply a talent for deception, but in the true crime arena, where every detail becomes suspect, it was enough to take root. Online forums framed him as a man capable of compartmentalization, someone trained to maintain composure under stress, someone who could theoretically hide secrets behind a disciplined exterior. Education also played into this narrative. Ramsey held degrees in engineering and business, further evidence of a mind attuned to detail and systems. Admirers saw these accomplishments as proof of competence and ambition. Detractors reframed them as qualities that could allow him to manipulate perception, to construct an alibi with precision, or to manage a cover story like a project plan. The same traits that helped him succeed in business were reinterpreted as tools for concealment. No court ever connected his military or educational background to wrongdoing. Still, in the relentless search for answers, nothing in his past was left untouched. Even achievements meant to symbolize honor and hard work became distorted, transformed into shadows by the hunger to explain the inexplicable. In the years after the case, online communities became a second courtroom. Platforms, social internet groups and amateur blogs gave space for speculation to flourish. Among the theories that gained traction were claims that John Ramsey had a history of concealing finances or masking personal behavior. These discussions rarely relied on verifiable documents. Instead, they were stitched together from fragments of corporate news, neighborhood rumors, and the family's polished public image. The financial accusations suggested that John's wealth was not as transparent as it appeared. Some posters pointed to the sale of Access graphics, arguing that hidden losses or secret arrangements must have existed beneath the surface. Others insisted that the Ramseys' lifestyle seemed excessive, that such affluence must have required manipulation or hidden accounts. None of these claims were supported by hard records, yet repetition online gave them weight. The more they were shared, the more they began to resemble truth in the minds of those desperate for answers. Personal allegations followed the same path. Commenters dissected old interviews, analyzing posture, tone, and word choice as if each detail contained evidence of deception. A smile at the wrong moment became proof of dishonesty. A calm expression were framed as coldness, or worse, a signal of guilt. The absence of emotion was treated as incriminating, despite psychologists noting that trauma often produces exactly that flatness. What stands out is not the accuracy of these claims but their persistence. They reveal how public suspicion can transform into narrative, how the vacuum left by an unsolved crime invites communities to create explanations, no matter how flimsy. In John Ramsey's case, the allegations of financial secrecy and hidden behavior remain unverified. Still, they linger online, shaping perception long after official investigations failed to support them. Publicly, John Ramsey's image was carefully constructed. He was not only a successful executive but also the father of a child beauty queen. Photographs of JonBenét in sequin dresses, smiling under stage lights, reinforced the picture of affluence and ambition. For many in Boulder, the Ramseys embodied achievement, wealth, a spacious home, children who appeared to thrive. That image became the foundation on which John's credibility rested. Yet, as with the financial and personal rumors that swirled online, critics found ways to fracture it. Some analysts argued that the child pageant world itself reflected deeper dysfunction. To them, placing a young girl in such a competitive spotlight suggested not only ambition but also unhealthy pressure from within the household. Pageants demanded makeup, costumes, and endless rehearsal activities some saw as harmless fun, while others interpreted them as signs of misplaced priorities. In this reading, the family's glossy exterior was less a reflection of joy and more a mask covering unresolved stress. Reports later compiled by investigators hinted at potential strains behind closed doors. While not conclusive, they raised questions about discipline, expectations, and boundaries within the home. Combined with speculation about finances and personal behavior, the image of a perfect family began to erode. Online communities connected these dots, suggesting that beneath the polished stage photos and professional success lay a structure that wasn't as stable as it appeared. Psychologically, this is the power of perception. What once looked like a portrait of success became reinterpreted as evidence of imbalance. John Ramsey, the businessman and proud father, was recast in the public mind as a figure whose achievements and lifestyle might have been underpinned by unhealthy dynamics. Even before tragedy, the seeds of suspicion had already been sown in the way his family presented itself to the world. Psychological readings of John Ramsey's behavior often rest on interpretation rather than fact. Experts who studied his interviews noted a tendency toward control, answers measured, tone restrained, emotions dampened even in moments when raw grief might have been expected. To some, this was the profile of a man trained to suppress weakness, a habit carried from military service and corporate life. To others, it hinted at something darker, a pattern of concealment, the instinct to withhold rather than reveal. There was no scandal tied to him before 1996, no public record of misconduct. Yet after the case erupted, analysts and commentators began projecting suspicions backward. Traits that once seemed like discipline were reframed as possible signs of a hidden history. Silence became secrecy. Calm became detachment. Even small pauses in his speech were dissected as evidence of control rather than shock. The grand jury proceedings of 1999 intensified this atmosphere. Although the indictment was sealed and ultimately not pursued in court, the mere suggestion that jurors saw grounds to charge the Ramseys with child endangerment and related offenses fueled retroactive suspicion. Online communities and some experts linked this to broader allegations of sensitivity, framing the family as potentially unstable long before JonBenét's death. These claims lacked corroboration from earlier records, but gained momentum because they seemed to fit the public perception of John's restrained, often opaque persona. What emerges is less a proven past than a psychological portrait shaped by hindsight. Analysts describe a man whose instinct for control left little room for transparency, a quality that in the fog of tragedy became indistinguishable from guilt. The absence of concrete evidence did not erase the impression. In the eyes of many, John Ramsey's demeanor alone suggested that shadows lingered, whether or not they could ever be substantiated. One of the most disputed moments in the investigation centers on John Ramsey's behavior when his daughter was discovered. Reports from police and later accounts in the media stated that John carried JonBenét from the basement to an upstairs room. In doing so, he also removed duct tape that had been placed across her mouth, tossing it onto the floor. For investigators, these actions represented a critical breach, the contamination of the crime scene at its most fragile stage. From a forensic standpoint, every element in that basement tape, cord, fibers, even the position of John Benet was evidence. By moving her, vital trace materials were disrupted or lost. The duct tape, once removed without gloves, could no longer be examined in its original condition for fingerprints or saliva. Herself, repositioned in another room, risked erasing signs of staging, struggle, or sequence of events. In the cold logic of crime scene science, John's actions amounted to tampering, whether intentional or not. Psychologically, his decision sparked debate. Some saw it as the natural reflex of a father, an instinct to comfort his child, even in death, removing what appeared to suffocate her. Others saw it as unnatural, a businessman accustomed to control, instantly interfering in ways that deflected proper examination. To critics, it looked less like grief and more like calculated obstruction. Police later described the scene as compromised beyond recovery. That contamination would haunt the case for decades, allowing defense attorneys to argue mismanagement while fueling public suspicion of the Ramsays themselves. The act of moving John Benet and discarding evidence may have been driven by emotion, but in the narrative of true crime, it became one of the pivotal details that blurred the line between victim's parent and potential suspect. Another detail that drew sharp scrutiny was John Ramsay's reported plan to leave Boulder almost immediately after his daughter was discovered. According to testimony and later analysis, he told investigators he needed to board his private plane for a can't-miss meeting scheduled outside the city. The timing was startling, barely 30 minutes after police confirmed a homicide in his own home. He was allegedly preparing to walk away from the investigation. In the context of grief, such behavior appeared deeply abnormal. Most parents, confronted with the violent death of a child, remain rooted in shock, unwilling to leave the scene. John's impulse to arrange a departure created suspicion that he was prioritizing business obligations or worse, attempting to distance himself from law enforcement oversight. Critics saw the private plane as a ready-made escape, a symbol of wealth and privilege used to slip past accountability. Later, John altered the narrative. He emphasized that the trip was not an attempt to flee but rather a business commitment misunderstood by others. In his telling, the plan dissolved as soon as police insisted he remain available. Still, the damage was done. Once the possibility of leaving was introduced, it cast doubt on his priorities and motives. Psychologically, the incident reinforced a broader portrait, a man who reverted to professional instinct in crisis. To arrange flights and meetings suggested a need for control, a refusal to surrender to chaos. But to many observers, that control looked cold, detached, even suspicious. The idea of leaving Boulder so quickly became a talking point in media coverage, feeding theories that John sought to evade scrutiny. No direct evidence proved he intended to escape justice. Yet, the mere perception of such a plan hardened public doubt, adding another shadow to his already complicated role in the case. From the earliest interviews, John Ramsay's emotional responses drew attention. Viewers and experts noted moments when his body language seemed at odds with the gravity of his daughter's death. In footage replayed for years, he occasionally smiled at inappropriate times, or maintained a calm, almost detached expression when raw grief was expected. Forensic psychologists describe this as incongruent affect emotional displays that fail to match the circumstances. To some observers, these reactions suggested concealment. A grieving father, they argued, should tremble, cry, rage against the injustice. Instead, John often appeared measured, composed, and in certain frames, oddly cheerful. Critics seized on these micro-expressions, claiming they betrayed hidden knowledge or suppressed guilt. In true crime forums, screenshots of his interviews became evidence in themselves, dissected frame by frame as if each smile carried a secret message. Behavioral experts, however, offered another perspective. Trauma can produce shock responses that look flat, even inappropriate. Smiles can emerge as nervous reflexes, a way the brain masks unbearable stress. Detachment can be the body's defense against overwhelming pain. In this reading, John's composure was not sinister but symptomatic of a man in crisis, falling back on years of training and control. Yet, in the court of public opinion, perception often outweighs science. The contrast between what people expected of a broken father and what they saw as a calm executive created a psychological gap. That gap was filled with suspicion. Every unusual gesture, every misplaced smile, became fuel for theories that John was more than a victim. The truth remains ambiguous. His emotional displays can be explained as either trauma or deception. But the damage was irreversible. Those strange smiles etched themselves into the collective memory of the case, forever shaping how the world viewed John Ramsay's innocence or guilt. Another element that deepened suspicion was John Ramsay's shifting narrative of the final night. In his earliest statements, he claimed he had read a storybook to both children Burke and John Benet before putting them to bed around 10:30 p.m. The details seemed ordinary, even tender, a father's memory of a family routine. Yet later, under questioning, he revised the account. He clarified that he had not read to both children as initially stated, but instead only tucked John Benet in, leaving Burke already asleep. The change was subtle, but in the context of a homicide investigation, even small alterations carried enormous weight. To investigators, this raised questions of credibility. Why would a father misremember such a poignant final interaction? Forensic interviewers note that genuine memories of a traumatic night tend to remain consistent, while fabricated or adjusted stories often shift under pressure. John's correction, whether innocent or not, created a crack in his reliability. Psychologically, the revision reinforced a pattern some analysts had already noted: his tendency to adjust narratives once contradictions appeared. Critics argued this was evidence of deliberate control, shaping the story to fit what police or media might later uncover. Supporters countered that trauma often distorts recall, and a man under immense stress could easily confuse details of bedtime routines, especially when recounting them amid interrogation. Still, the inconsistency left room for doubt. If he misstated the bedtime, what else might have been misrepresented? The timeline of that night was central to every theory of family involvement or intruder. A single conflicting detail weakened John's credibility and allowed conspiracy to thrive. Whether a simple lapse in memory or a calculated correction, the shift in his story ensured that the last night would remain forever clouded in ambiguity. Perhaps the most enduring mystery tied to John Ramsay is the ransom note found in his home. 3 pages long, written in a strange blend of formal and theatrical language, it demanded a very specific sum: $118,000. The number struck investigators immediately because it mirrored almost exactly the amount of John's Christmas bonus from Access Graphics that year. In kidnapping cases, ransom demands usually round to large figures: $50,000, $500,000, or $1 million. Rarely is the number so precise, so intimately tied to a victim's financial life. John himself attempted to explain it, noting the coincidence of his bonus, and suggesting that someone with insider knowledge must have written the note. He framed the figure as evidence of an intruder who knew details of his compensation. But skeptics argued the opposite. To them, the demand felt staged, as though the writer deliberately chose a number tied to John in order to misdirect or fabricate realism. Critics pointed out that the note, at nearly 400 words, read more like a script than a hurried demand. Psychologically, the ransom note served as a litmus test for public opinion. Those who suspected family involvement viewed the $118,000 as a telltale slip: too personal, too exact to be random. Supporters of the intruder theory emphasized that such precision could only come from someone with knowledge of the Ramsays' finances, implying a stalker or acquaintance with access to corporate information. The note itself has never yielded definitive answers. Handwriting analysis failed to conclusively tie it to Patsy Ramsey or anyone else. Forensic testing revealed no clear suspect. Yet, the bizarre figure of $118,000 remains one of the most haunting details of the case. It symbolizes the blurred line between coincidence and design, a number that continues to divide theories about whether John Ramsay was the victim or architect of a staged crime. When investigators reconstructed the morning of December 26, they found John Ramsay's behavior at odds with what most would expect from a grieving parent. Instead of preserving privacy or focusing on immediate cooperation with law enforcement, he and Patsy invited friends, neighbors, and even their family priest into the home almost immediately. The decision, while perhaps intended to seek comfort, filled the house with people and compromised the integrity of the crime scene. For detectives, it blurred the line between tragedy and obstruction. Typically, parents of child victims cling to silence, collapse into grief, or remain under close guidance of police. John's actions appeared more social than protective. As officers attempted to establish control, the flow of visitors complicated the process. Potential evidence was trampled, touched, or rearranged. What might have been key forensic clues were drowned in the chaos of hospitality. To investigators, this suggested either a profound misunderstanding of procedure or an indifference to justice. Later, these choices were defended as instinctive: John and Patsy seeking solace in their community, their church, and the familiar faces of friends. Trauma specialists note that people in shock often revert to routine behaviors, drawing loved ones close. Yet critics saw something calculated in the gathering. By surrounding themselves with allies and spiritual figures, the Ramsays may have unintentionally shielded themselves from scrutiny, creating a protective wall at the very moment police needed access. Psychologically, the inconsistency between expected grief and actual response became part of the case's mythology. Every smile, every visitor welcomed into the house, became fuel for speculation. John Ramsay's role as father was judged not only by the loss of his child, but by how strangely he managed that loss in its earliest hours. The contradictions reinforced suspicion, leaving his innocence perpetually questioned. During the investigation, John Ramsay's interactions with friends became another area of scrutiny. Fleet White, once considered one of his closest allies, slowly shifted into a more complicated figure. In testimony given years later, John described Fleet's behavior as strange. He recalled incidents where White confronted investigators directly, even storming into offices to criticize the pace and direction of the case. Such outbursts, while perhaps born of frustration, created an air of volatility around someone who had once been central to the Ramsay's support network. From John's perspective, these actions represented a rupture in trust. What had started as solidarity between families quickly descended into tension, with Fleet's aggressive demands casting doubt on both the investigation and the Ramsays themselves. To observers, it was unusual that Frankdoms rarely became so combative toward law enforcement without some deeper friction motivating the conflict. Psychologists analyzing the relationship suggested that trauma and suspicion may have fed the rift. Fleet White had been present on the day JonBenet was discovered, making him a direct witness to events. His insistence on criticizing investigators could be read as a desperate attempt to ensure thoroughness or as an effort to distance himself from scrutiny. For John, labeling White's conduct as odd might have been a defensive maneuver, subtly shifting focus away from himself. Media coverage amplified the discord. Stories about the broken friendship painted the Ramsays as increasingly isolated, their once loyal friends turning skeptical. Instead of unity, the public saw fracture. The unusual behavior of Fleet White, paired with John's careful comments, left the impression of hidden tensions within Boulder's elite circle. In a case already marred by contradictions, the strained friendship became one more sign that nothing about the Ramsays' world was as stable as it appeared. From the moment cameras turned toward him, John Ramsay's presence in the media became as much evidence in the court of public opinion as anything found in his home. He sat for multiple televised interviews, sometimes alongside Patsy, other times alone, each appearance meant to project transparency. Yet analysts and viewers often came away unsettled. His body language, they argued, didn't match the circumstances. Instead of the broken demeanor expected of a grieving father, he often appeared measured, composed, and even at times smiling. Behavioral experts called this incongruent effect, a mismatch between situation and displayed emotion. In clips replayed endlessly on cable news, John would describe tragic details with a flat tone, then curve his lips into what looked like a half smile. To those primed for suspicion, the gestures read as chilling, the opposite of empathy. True crime forums froze frames, circling moments where his expression seemed off, claiming they revealed deception. But there was another interpretation. Psychologists noted that trauma can distort expression, producing nervous laughter, misplaced smiles, or emotional numbness. People in shock often compartmentalize, especially those with backgrounds in military or corporate environments where composure is valued. In this reading, John's calm and occasional smile weren't evidence of guilt but rather symptoms of a man struggling under unbearable weight. Still, perception mattered more than nuance. The interviews, broadcast to millions, became artifacts for speculation. Each pause, each smile, each carefully measured phrase was treated as a clue. Supporters saw a man enduring trauma in public. Critics saw a mask cracking under pressure. In the end, the interviews didn't resolve anything. Instead, they deepened the divide, proof to some of innocence, to others of complicity. The image of John Ramsay before the cameras remains one of the most polarizing aspects of the case. One of the most controversial threads running through the case has been the suggestion of sensitive behavior of JonBenet. Certain medical findings in the autopsy were interpreted by some experts as possible signs of prior trauma. These interpretations, though disputed, created a narrative that JonBenet's death might not have been the first episode of harm. In that frame, John Ramsay's behavior, his calmness, his tendency to control the flow of information, his decision to alter small details in statements was reinterpreted as concealment. He consistently denied every allegation. In interviews and public appearances, John rejected the notion that sensitivity occurred in his home. DNA testing in 2008 further complicated the picture, excluding the family and pointing instead to an unidentified male profile. For many, this should have been the end of the speculation. Yet suspicion endured because the allegations had already taken root in public discourse. Behavioral analysts pointed to the way John sometimes deflected questions or shifted explanations as evidence of a man hiding something. Critics argued that his role as the financial and emotional head of the household meant he had the most to lose if darker truths were revealed. Supporters countered that such behavior could just as easily be explained by trauma, media pressure, and the instinct of a corporate leader to manage appearances. The linking of John Ramsay to sensitivity was never supported by a court ruling or direct evidence. Still, the combination of ambiguous medical findings and his controlled demeanor allowed theories to thrive. In the ecosystem of true crime, ambiguity is fertile ground. Whether unfair projection or legitimate suspicion, John's behavior became inseparable from the lingering question: was he simply a grieving father, or was his composure the mask of a man with something far more damaging to hide? In 2006, nearly a decade after JonBenet's murder, John Ramsay faced another profound loss. His wife, Patsy, succumbed to ovarian cancer at the age of 49. For John, it was a second devastation layered onto a life already marked by public tragedy. He spoke of her passing as the single greatest personal loss since the death of their daughter, describing a home once filled with family now hollowed by absence. Unlike the scrutiny that surrounded JonBenet's case, Patsy's illness and death unfolded quietly, an ending fought in hospitals rather than courtrooms. John later reflected that his wife's strength, particularly her faith, carried the family through years of suspicion and media assault. With her gone, he leaned more heavily on religion, often citing belief as the foundation that allowed him to keep moving forward. Friends described him attending church regularly, maintaining a private but steady devotion. Where public image had once defined him a businessman, a father, a suspect, faith became his refuge, the lens through which he processed grief. For many, his loss humanized him again. Stripped of the polished family image that once drew both admiration and suspicion, John appeared as a widower navigating pain beyond the comprehension of most. Yet critics remained unmoved, suggesting that his narrative of faith and resilience was another calculated performance. What cannot be denied is that Patsy's death closed a chapter. She had been central to the family's public defense, the figure who, despite illness, sat in front of cameras insisting on innocence. Without her, John's voice became quieter, less frequent in the media. The tragedy that began with the death of a daughter had, by 2006, expanded into the loss of a wife, leaving John Ramsey to carry alone the burden of grief, memory, and enduring suspicion. In 2011, 5 years after losing Patsy, John Ramsey remarried. His new wife, Jan Rosaux, was a designer with a career outside the corporate and media spotlight that had defined so much of his earlier life. The ceremony was quiet, a deliberate contrast to the attention that had surrounded every previous milestone in the Ramsey story. Moving to Michigan, John sought distance from Boulder and from the relentless coverage that had shadowed him for more than a decade. Friends and acquaintances described the marriage as a chance for renewal. After years of suspicion and grief, John was trying to carve out a space where he could simply exist as a husband rather than as the father of a murdered child. Michigan provided anonymity that Boulder could no longer offer. There, he focused on family, faith, and the daily routines of ordinary life, routines that had been denied him since December 1996. Still, the past could not be erased. Even in Michigan, whispers followed. True crime programs, online discussions, and anniversary specials ensured that the Ramsey name remained linked to tragedy. John responded by reducing his public appearances, granting only occasional interviews when major developments, such as DNA testing, surfaced. His new marriage represented a conscious step toward privacy, an effort to shield his second wife from the storm that had consumed his first. Psychologically, the remarriage can be seen as resilience, a man refusing to let grief permanently define him. Yet to critics, it was viewed through suspicion, another move in a long pattern of control and reinvention. Regardless of interpretation, the fact remains, by 2011, John Ramsey was living not as a businessman under scrutiny, but as a man attempting to build a second life, defined less by public trial and more by quiet survival. For John Ramsey, the survival of his family became just as defining as the tragedy that shattered it. His son Burke, thrust into the public eye at age 9, grew up under a cloud of suspicion fueled by tabloid headlines and television specials. In 2016, a CBS documentary suggested he may have been responsible for JonBenet's death, reviving old theories without definitive proof. The fallout was immediate. Burke, backed by his father, filed a defamation lawsuit against the network. In 2019, the case was settled, with Burke receiving a substantial but undisclosed financial payout. For John, the victory was symbolic. A moment where one of his children reclaimed dignity after decades of unwanted speculation. John Andrew, his eldest from his first marriage, took on a quieter but equally important role. He publicly described the family as normal before the murder, emphasizing that the Ramseys were not the sinister household critics portrayed. His words, though simple, carried weight, offering a counter-narrative to the endless accusations. For John Ramsey, having a grown son defend the family's humanity was a reminder that not all voices had turned against him. The relationships were shaped by resilience and defense. John supported Burke's legal fight, understanding how damaging public suspicion had been. At the same time, he leaned on John Andrew's steady presence as a way to remind the world of the family's life before everything unraveled. Both sons embodied different dimensions of survival, one pursuing justice against slander, the other preserving memory. Psychologically, these dynamics underscore John's role as a father still trying to protect his children, even after one was lost. The courtrooms and media cameras never stopped circling, but through it all, his relationship with Burke and John Andrew offered him continuity, proof that, despite suspicion, parts of the Ramsey family endured. In 2008, a breakthrough in forensic testing shifted the narrative. New DNA analysis, conducted with more advanced technology than had been available in the 1990s, excluded the Ramsey family from the material found on John Benet's clothing. Then District Attorney Mary Lacey issued a public letter formally clearing John, Patsy, and Burke, stating that they were no longer considered suspects. For John, it was vindication, scientific proof that his family had been falsely accused for over a decade. Yet the announcement did not erase the years of suspicion or undo the damage already inflicted by relentless media coverage. Even with the exoneration, John Ramsey found himself still battling the court of public opinion. Documentaries, books, and televised specials continued to recycle old theories, often portraying the family as complicit in a cover-up. Each new anniversary of the case invited another wave of speculation. In response, John and his legal team pursued defamation suits, targeting media outlets and individuals who crossed the line between theory and accusation. The most notable victory came years later when his son Burke successfully sued CBS for a 2016 docuseries that implied his involvement in John Benet's death. The settlement, reached in 2019, reinforced the idea that reckless reporting had lasting consequences. For John, supporting that lawsuit was both personal and symbolic, an attempt to hold powerful networks accountable for perpetuating narratives science had already dismantled. Psychologically, the persistence of these battles revealed John's struggle to reclaim control over his family's identity. DNA evidence might have cleared their names in the eyes of law enforcement, but in the broader culture, shadows remained. Lawsuits became his means of fighting back, not just for justice, but for dignity. 2 decades after the tragedy, the fight was no longer about evidence. It was about rewriting the legacy of a family forever scarred by suspicion. Nearly 3 decades after his daughter's death, John Ramsey shifted from defending himself to campaigning for systemic change. By 2024, he had become an advocate for new legislation in Honda giving families of murder victims more authority in how unsolved cases are handled. Specifically, he pushed for laws that would allow relatives to request independent reviews of cold cases, including access to advanced forensic testing like whole genome sequencing. For Ramsey, this was no longer just about John Benet. It was about preventing other families from enduring the same decades of frustration. He argued that the current system left too much discretion in the hands of local prosecutors and law enforcement, many of whom resisted revisiting old files. Families, he said, were often sidelined, forced to watch investigations stall while newer cases received resources. His proposed framework would allow direct petitions for independent analysis, ensuring that modern tools could be applied even when official agencies were reluctant. In public statements and interviews, Ramsey framed the issue as both moral and practical. DNA science had advanced dramatically since the 1990s, offering possibilities often at the time of John Benet's murder. To withhold such tools, he insisted, was not only negligent but cruel to families still waiting for justice. The campaign resonated with other victims' relatives across Colorado and beyond. By 2025, Ramsey's advocacy became part of a broader national conversation about how to handle cold cases in an era of rapid forensic innovation. While critics saw it as another way for him to keep the spotlight, supporters recognized the personal cost he carried into the fight. After years of suspicion, lawsuits, and unanswered questions, John Ramsey recast himself as a reformer using his tragedy to argue for a system that no longer leaves families powerless. By 2025, John Ramsey was no longer simply a grieving father or a man defending himself against suspicion. He had become an active per efforts to push the John Benet case forward. That year, he attended meetings with Boulder police officials, pressing them to authorize advanced DNA testing using genetic genealogy, the same method that had solved dozens of other cold cases across the country. For Ramsey, it was the most tangible hope left after nearly 3 decades of stalemate. Reports from those close to the discussions described him as measured but insistent. He emphasized that the family was not asking for special treatment, only that the same tools available to other departments be applied here. Whole genome sequencing and genealogical databases, he argued, could finally identify the unknown male profile discovered in 2008, the DNA that had formally cleared the Ramseys of direct involvement. His message was simple: the evidence exists, the technology exists, and delay only prolongs injustice. These meetings were also deeply personal. Ramsey reportedly told investigators that every year without answers another wound reopened, not just for him but for his surviving children and for the public still haunted by the case. His tone carried both frustration and resolve. He acknowledged the strained relationship with Boulder authorities but framed cooperation as the only path to resolution. Symbolically, the image of John Ramsey returning to Boulder Police Headquarters in 2025 carried weight. For some, it showed persistence bordering on obsession. For others, it showed a father refusing to give up. Psychologically, it reflected a transformation from suspect to survivor to advocate. Nearly 30 years on, John Ramsay's presence at those meetings underscored his enduring hope that science could finally give clarity where suspicion and rumor had failed. In 2004, John Ramsay made an unexpected move. He entered politics. After years of being defined by the unsolved murder of his daughter, he sought to redirect his energy into public service, announcing his candidacy for a seat in the Michigan House of Representatives. His campaign emphasized crime, justice, and community safety issues that had become inseparable from his own personal history. For Ramsay, the bid was not just about politics, it was an attempt to reframe himself as a reformer rather than a perpetual suspect. The campaign drew media attention immediately. Supporters saw a man who had endured unimaginable tragedy and now wanted to use his experience to push for stronger policies. Critics, however, viewed the candidacy as opportunistic, suggesting that he was leveraging notoriety rather than credentials. Debates in town halls often circled back to John Benet, no matter how much Ramsay tried to focus on legislation. His name, inseparable from the case, was both his recognition and his burden. In the end, the campaign faltered. He lost the election, a reminder that public perception remained divided. For some voters, sympathy was not enough to overcome doubt. For others, the case overshadowed every policy position he proposed. Yet the effort revealed something significant about his psyche, a refusal to retreat entirely into private grief, a determination to confront the public sphere even when it risked further scrutiny. After the defeat, Ramsay did not pursue further political office. Instead, he returned to quieter advocacy, channeling his efforts into justice reform and cold case legislation. Still, the 2004 campaign remains a curious chapter in his life, an attempt to transform personal tragedy into political influence, and a testament to the complex ways John Ramsay has navigated identity, suspicion, and public service in the decades since his daughter's death. Beyond politics, John Ramsay turned to writing as another way to reclaim his story. He authored books reflecting on faith, loss, and resilience, framing himself not as a suspect but as a father trying to survive the unimaginable. In his memoirs, he emphasized the role of religion in keeping him grounded, describing prayer and belief as lifelines through years of public suspicion. For readers sympathetic to his ordeal, the books offered a more intimate portrait of a man stripped of wealth and status, left only with grief and faith. Alongside writing, Ramsay became a familiar figure in interviews, revisiting the case across decades. Some appearances were defensive, designed to counter narratives in the media. Others were reflective, exploring themes of mourning, endurance, and the pursuit of justice. Each interview, however, reopened debate. Supporters saw his willingness to speak as transparency. Critics viewed it as image management, another attempt to control the narrative rather than submit to it. In 2024, his story entered a new medium when he participated in a Netflix production examining the failures of the Boulder Police Department. In that interview, Ramsay did not focus on defending himself but rather turned attention outward, highlighting mistakes in the early investigation, the compromised crime scene, missed forensic opportunities, and the refusal to fully embrace modern DNA testing. His words echoed years of frustration but also positioned him as a voice for reform, pressing the case not only as a personal tragedy, but as an emblem of systemic failure. The book publications and high-profile interviews together shaped John Ramsay's later public image. No longer only the grieving father, no longer just the accused, he became the commentator, someone using his platform to criticize institutions, defend his family's honor, and insist that justice for John Benet was still possible. Over the decades, John Ramsay faced an avalanche of conspiracy theories. Online forums, television specials, and tabloid headlines repeatedly placed him at the center of speculation. Some claimed he staged a kidnapping, others suggested financial or personal motives, and still others tied him to elaborate cover-ups. Rather than retreat completely, John adopted a consistent line in public. He denied the accusations firmly, but refused to let them consume him. In interviews, he often said he could not waste energy defending against every rumor. Instead, he emphasized the goal that mattered, finding John Benet's killer. This approach, however, drew mixed reactions. Supporters saw it as dignified, the posture of a man refusing to be dragged into endless battles with gossip. Critics saw it as evasive, noting that his calm detachment sometimes made him appear indifferent to charges most people would fight with rage. Psychologists pointed out that trauma survivors often compartmentalize, pushing aside emotional reactions in order to preserve focus. For John, concentrating on justice rather than defending reputation may have been a survival mechanism. Still, the conspiracies left scars. Each anniversary of the case reignited speculation, and each new documentary recycled familiar theories. John countered not with outrage but with persistence. He leaned on faith, family, and his advocacy for DNA testing as the most powerful rebuttal. Science would prove what rumor could not. By downplaying the accusations and redirecting attention toward the investigation, John tried to reshape his image from suspect to advocate. Yet, perception remained divided. To some, his refusal to engage looked like strength. To others, it looked like concealment. What cannot be denied is that John Ramsay lived under suspicion longer than most men could endure, and his strategy was to keep his eyes fixed on the only truth he believed mattered: the search for the real killer. As years passed without resolution, John Ramsay began pointing to other unsolved crimes in the hope of widening the investigative lens. One example was a 1997 assault reported near Boulder, involving a young girl attacked in her bedroom by an unknown intruder. The similarities were unsettling: forced entry, a child targeted at night, and a suspect who vanished without leaving a clear trail. Ramsay highlighted this case as potentially connected, urging investigators to consider the possibility of a predator operating in the area rather than focusing solely on his family. His reasoning was both practical and personal. Practically, linking the two cases suggested that Boulder police may have overlooked a broader of child victimization in the region. Personally, it shifted the spotlight from the Ramsays themselves to the possibility of an external offender. By proposing connections, John tried to reframe the narrative. His daughter's death was not an isolated family tragedy, but part of a larger failure to stop a dangerous intruder. Law enforcement did not fully embrace the theory. Officials noted differences in method and cautioned against assuming a link without forensic evidence. Still, the suggestion drew attention in the media, especially as true crime reporting increasingly explored unsolved cases in clusters. For supporters of the intruder theory, the 1997 assault added weight to their belief that John Benet's killer had been an outsider who had struck before and might strike again. Psychologically, John's push reflected determination to keep the investigation open and directed outward. Rather than resigning to suspicion, he sought alternative narratives that explained both the crime and the persistent DNA evidence excluding his family. While no formal connection was ever proven, his effort underscored his enduring strategy, redirecting suspicion away from the Ramsays and toward the possibility of a wider, overlooked threat. At 80 years old, John Ramsay remains a figure caught between the weight of personal tragedy and the persistence of public suspicion. Nearly 3 decades have passed since the night John Benet was found in the basement of the family's Boulder home. Yet for John, the case has never truly passed. He has grown older, his professional and political ambitions long behind him, but the pursuit of answers continues to define his life. Time, rather than dulling the pain, has only reinforced his determination to see justice done before his own life draws to a close. In recent interviews, John emphasizes hope in science, particularly the advancement of DNA technology. The profile recovered in 2008, which cleared the Ramsay family, remains the central thread of possibility, with whole genome sequencing and genetic genealogy now solving cases once thought impossible. John argues that the key to John Benet's killer lies not in speculation but in applying those tools. His advocacy has evolved from personal defense to broader reform, lobbying for laws that allow families of cold case victims to petition for independent testing, and attending meetings with Boulder police in 2025 to urge adoption of new methods. To him, the future of the case is inseparable from the evolution of forensic science. At the same time, his faith continues to anchor him. After losing his daughter to murder and his wife Patsy to cancer, religion became the framework through which he interpreted survival. Friends describe him as quiet, reflective, and consistent in attending church. In his own words, belief has been the only constant in a life marked by relentless upheaval. Faith provides not only comfort, but also a moral structure for his advocacy, the conviction that truth and justice, however delayed, are still possible. The long-term impact of the case on John's life cannot be overstated. Professionally, his career in business effectively ended. Politically, his bid for office in 2004 failed under the shadow of suspicion. Personally, every relationship has been filtered through the lens of tragedy, from strained friendships like Fleet White to the legal battles supporting his children. Even in remarriage, the case hovered in the background. John's existence has been one of resilience but also of continual negotiation with a public that cannot forget or forgive easily. Now at 80, his perspective reflects both exhaustion and persistence. He acknowledges the damage done by years of media speculation but resists bitterness. Instead, he speaks of endurance, of continuing to hoe a resolution through DNA, and of trusting in God's plan. To some, he is a man unfairly vilified. To others, he remains a suspect. But in his own telling, he is simply a father who refuses to let his daughter's case fade into silence. In that sense, John Ramsay's legacy is paradoxical, both a victim of tragedy and suspicion, both cleared by science and judged by perception. What endures is his unwavering hope as an 80-year-old man still waiting for the day when science, justice, and faith converge to the case that has defined his life. When people recall the Ramsay name, they often think of wealth, the spacious Boulder home, the luxury cars, the image of affluence projected in family photographs. Yet the reality after John Benet's murder was far more complicated. The investigation and relentless public scrutiny bled John Ramsay financially in ways that are sometimes overshadowed by the emotional devastation. Access Graphics, the company John had steered to success, was eventually sold to Lockheed Martin. While the sale was profitable on paper, it marked the end of his direct involvement in a business career that had once defined him. Corporate transitions, legal fees, and the costs of defending himself and his family chipped away at his financial stability. He was forced to spend heavily on attorneys, private investigators, and public relations experts, expenses that mounted over years of speculation and litigation. By his own accounts, John lost significant portions of his fortune, a reality that contrasted sharply with the public image of an untouchable executive. The house in Boulder was eventually sold, and the family's lifestyle contracted under the strain. The glittering picture of success that had made the Ramsays a subject of fascination dissolved, replaced by the harder reality of survival under accusation. Yet financial collapse did not mean surrender. John turned to lawsuits not only as a defense of reputation but also as a way to rebuild. Settlements from defamation cases, particularly the one involving his son Burke and CBS, provided resources that helped stabilize the family. These victories were not just monetary. They represented moments where the family, long battered by rumor, could point to legal acknowledgement that the media had crossed lines. In this way, John used the courts as both shield and lifeline, transforming financial losses into a new form of endurance. Even as the law cleared him, the court of public opinion remained divided. Online communities, first message boards in the early 2000s, later Reddit threads and Facebook groups kept the case alive in perpetual debate. For every post defending John as a grieving father, there were others dissecting his body language, his interviews, or the ransom note's odd figure of $118,000. These forums often painted him as manipulative, capable of concealing beneath a calm exterior. To many participants, the DNA evidence that formally exonerated the family in 2008 was not enough. They pointed to inconsistencies in John's statements, to his decision to move John Benet, or to his plan to leave Boulder on the morning after the discovery. Each detail, no matter how small, was magnified into suspicion. From John's perspective, these endless discussions were noise. He frequently stated in interviews that he could not waste his life fighting conspiracy theories. He admitted he knew many still doubted him but insisted he was focused on one goal, finding the real killer. In one sense, this was resignation, in another, it was strategy. By refusing to engage directly with online rumors, John positioned himself as forward-looking, channeling his energy into advocacy for cold case reform rather than mudslinging. Yet the chatter never stopped. Every new documentary or anniversary rekindled debate, with younger generations joining in through social media. John became less of a businessman or politician in the eyes of the public and more a character in a collective narrative, shaped by strangers who had never met him but felt entitled to judge his every gesture. The turning point in John Ramsay's later years came when he chose not only to defend his name but also to press for systemic change. Beginning in the 2010s, he became vocal about the need for law enforcement to embrace modern forensic tools. By 2024 and 2025, his role expanded into advocacy for legislation in Colorado that would allow families of murder victims to petition for independent review of cold cases. For John, this was deeply personal. The unknown male DNA profile identified in 2008 had cleared his family, yet investigators hesitated to pursue advanced genetic genealogy testing. John argued this was unacceptable, not just for his case but for all families left waiting in limbo. He pressed lawmakers and police, emphasizing that whole genome sequencing and genealogical databases had already solved other decades-old crimes. His campaign reframed him not as a defendant but as a reformer. In 2025, he even attended meetings with Boulder police, urging them to authorize the use of new technology on the evidence collected from John Benet's case. His presence symbolized both persistence and vulnerability, a father now 80 years old, still fighting for clarity, refusing to let bureaucracy close the book on his daughter. For some, it was admirable. For others, it seemed like an obsession. But for John, it was the clearest reason to keep pushing forward despite age loss and exhaustion. John Ramsay's financial and social trajectory after 1996 reflects a dramatic arc, from affluence and power, to ruin and suspicion, and finally to cautious rebuilding. The wealth that once shielded him became irrelevant in the face of relentless media coverage. Legal settlements later restored some stability, but they could never erase the reputational damage inflicted by years of speculation. More enduring than money was the shift in his public identity. Once seen as a businessman, he is now remembered primarily as John Benet's father, a man forever bound to a crime that remains unsolved. The suspicion, even after DNA cleared him, is part of that identity. But so too is his resilience, his willingness to speak, to write, to campaign, and to fight. In interviews, John frames his current life around faith and justice. He acknowledges the pain of losing Patsy in 2006 and the difficulty of raising surviving children under constant scrutiny. He takes pride in Burke's legal victory against CBS and in John Andrews' quiet defense of the family as normal before tragedy. These small victories are stitched together as proof that survival is possible even under the heaviest burden. At 80, John insists he does not dwell on what others think. Online discussions, however cruel, are not his focus. His eyes remain on the possible technology may one day answer the questions left open since 1996. He still believes justice is possible, not only for his daughter but for every family trapped in the silence of an unsolved crime. John Ramsey's long journey illustrates how tragedy can reorder every element of a life: finances, friendships, public image, and private faith. He lost wealth, career, and the protective bubble of respectability. He endured decades of suspicion from both investigators and strangers online, yet he also rebuilt, securing legal victories, remarrying, and redirecting his focus toward reform. The community will likely continue debating his role for years to come. Forums will analyze his interviews, documentaries will recycle theories, and anniversaries will reopen wounds. But in John's own telling, these are distractions. His measure of success is not whether he convinces skeptics, but whether science can eventually name the killer who ended his daughter's life. The legacy of John Ramsey at 80 is therefore paradoxical. He is at once a man scarred by financial ruin and public doubt, and a man defined by persistence, faith, and the will to advocate for change. For him, the true victory lies not in wealth restored or image repaired, but in the hope that John Benet's case and others like it can finally find justice through the tools of a new generation.